afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. In its second interim report, the Synodal study group continued to talk about a paradigm shift in continuity with Vatican II and labeled homosexuality as an quote-unquote emerging issue. Catholic teaching on issues of morality cannot change. So what do some people try to? Richard Spinello joins us. Richard is professor of management practice at Boston College and a member of the adjunct faculty at St. John's Seminary in Boston. Richard, great to speak with you again. How are you?
Yes, I'm very good, Marcus. Nice to speak with you, too. It's good to be back.
It's always good to reconnect with you. I appreciate your thoughts on these matters. And for the sake of our listeners, I'd like to ask if you could begin by sharing about these study groups. Some people might forget, while the main parts of the Synod on Synodality are over, some study groups continue to function.
Yes, there are 10 study groups that are looking at different issues that were sort of taken off the table at the Synod because they were somewhat complicated. And one of them is a study group that's looking at controversial issues. And those are, for the most part, though not exclusively, issues about sexual morality. So they issued their preliminary report back in June. And then they issued another interim report just a few weeks ago. But their final report comes out this month, supposedly. It's supposed to come out towards the end of the month. So we'll have to see what their recommendations are. But in the preliminary report, they kind of signaled their preference for a paradigm shift when talking about sexual morality and trying to prioritize personal experience and discernment and what they called contextual fidelity to the gospel. They said, well, that's preferable to what we have now, which is sort of an emphasis on, they call it prepackaged objective norms. So, and the second interim report seemed to indicate that that was still their direction. So it could be very interesting to see what they come up with when this final report comes out this month, and that'll be delivered to Pope Leo. They're just recommendations, so we'll have to see what Pope Leo does with this particular report, however it shakes out.
Whatever modifications, even before we talk about the perennial unchanging moral doctrine of the Church, let's try to dive into the minds of the thinkers in these study groups. They're showing preference for a paradigm shift, which means it's that age-old nonsense that we've been dealing with about the call for a new anthropology. Can you please speak to that so our listeners understand what quote-unquote nuance is being pushed forth here?
Well, I'm not really sure what they're getting at with this paradigm shift, but it does seem to reflect a kind of modernist historicism, which is arguing that truths of the faith are something that can be changed. They're not perennial, they're not absolute, they're not immutable, but they can somehow be changed and adjusted. And I think that's what they're aiming at. They're aiming for a kind of doctrinal flexibility that will give people some leeway when they're making moral decisions, so that people will not be dealing with absolutes. Abortion is absolutely wrong all the time, or contraception is absolutely wrong all the time, but rather it'll be more of a situation in which people will look at all the different factors involved in a decision, and they'll act accordingly in contextual, again, to use their phrase, contextual fidelity to the gospel. The gospel will be some element, but in making that final determination, but other things will come into play, such as experience, people's personal experience. That's very different from the way the Catholic Church sees these issues. It does see some of them clearly in terms of black and white. And I think a lot of people, a lot of contemporary moral theologians don't want to see things that way. Mm-hmm. They don't want to see things in absolute terms or see things in terms of black and white. They want to emphasize the gray area, and I think that's where all this is sort of leading. That's what the paradigm shift perhaps is all about.
I'm glad you presented that context, because from there, we can touch on some of the statements Pope Leo XIV has made. For example, in his interview with Crux that was published in September, the statement made waves. It was unfortunately not as clear as I would have hoped. And so one way to legitimately read it is that a potential of change in church doctrine is possible. And that's been a cause of real concern for people confused by that.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that interview that he gave with Crux a few months ago, he was asked about whether or not there would be any changes in the church's sexual teaching, his teaching on sexual morality. And he said, he first of all said, well, I don't plan on making any changes. I wouldn't count on that. So that's kind of comforting that he said, he has no big plans to all of a sudden overhaul the church's teaching on sexual morality. But he goes on to say, well, I think we have to change attitudes before we even think about changing what the church says about any given question. So he does seem to leave the door open to doctrinal flexibility, and he seems to say that if there were a change in attitude about these issues in the church, then that could lead to a change in doctrine. But that's not what he should have said. I hate to sound presumptuous and correct the Holy Father, and maybe he didn't, maybe he didn't mean that exactly. I misspoke, but he should have made it clear that these teachings can't change. That's impossible to change them. These doctrines are not historically conditioned. They're not contingent on public opinion or personal experience. They're based on the eternal order of truth and values. They're rooted in the truth about human nature, which is immutable. They're rooted in the truths of the Holy Scripture. They're rooted in the truths of the Church's tradition. They're not something we can change. The Church isn't a kind of a political institution that has these policies that all of a sudden some pope can come along and say, well, I'm going to change all this. That's just not the way it works. It kind of that attitude would go against the Church as an ontological and sacramental reality, not a political one. So it's a little bit disconcerting, the Pope's comments. Again, I mean, this is one of the first interviews he gave, so maybe he would want to qualify his comments a little bit. The problem is that people hear this and they say, oh, wow, and the usual suspects actually did this. They say, wow, all we got to do is sort of change people's attitudes, and we can see a big change in the Church's teaching on sexual morality. But that clearly is not the case.
I want to ask if you could also speak to the concerns of our listeners, just following from that question and answer, which is, can the ordinary magisterium of any reigning supreme pontiff violate the perennial magisterium of the Church or the ordinary magisteriums of popes in the past?
Yeah, it can't. It can't. These doctrines are really infallible. They are, and they can't be changed. For example, the teaching of Humanae Vitae represents, which forbids contraception of any kind, represents an infallible teaching of the ordinary magisterium. And it insists that all sexual acts have to be generative in kind. You can't really change that because it's an infallible teaching of the Church. Whenever the bishops, together with the Pope, proclaim a doctrine of faith and morals, as they did about contraception, it's an infallible assertion of the ordinary magisterium. This is all spelled out in Vatican II. So progressive Catholics always tell us, well, Vatican II, Vatican II, Vatican II. Well, Lumen Gentium in Vatican II spells this out very clearly. So if we're really going to be Catholics who live up to Vatican II, we want to recognize that these teachings really are infallible. The teachings of Humanae Vitae, other teachings of sexual morality that the faithful, from the bishops to the laity, held for a long time. The 12th paragraph of Lumen Gentium says that the faithful cannot err when they all agree on a set of issues and what they take to be God's revealed word about faith and morals. So these teachings can't be mistaken. They can't be changed.
Richard, thank you so much. My guest has been Richard Spinello, Professor of Management at Boston College, and we've been talking about the Church being unable to change its teachings.